There's a moment, and most people miss it because they're not looking for it, when something gives up. Not dramatically, not with noise or collapse, just quietly. A shift behind the eyes, a stillness that wasn't there yesterday. You see it in old horses left too long in the rain. You see it in children sitting alone at lunch tables, staring at the wall. You see it in men who have stopped arguing because they've decided arguing no longer changes anything. I saw it in a donkey foal. He was maybe 4 months old, standing in the far corner of a pen that held 30 other animals. Goats, mules, 2 jennies, a couple of sway-backed horses nobody wanted anymore. He wasn't injured, wasn't visibly sick. He just stood there with his head dropped low and his ears folded back, and every single animal in that pen ignored him like he was part of the fence post. Nobody had named him. That's the first sign. When nobody gives something a name, it means they haven't decided it's worth the grief of losing it. I've kept a logbook since I was 17 years old, my father's habit, then mine. Every morning a few lines, what the weather did, what the land needed, what I noticed. People make fun of me for it sometimes, say a working rancher doesn't have time for journaling, say it's a school teacher's habit, not a cowboy's. But my father always said, if you don't write down what you saw, you start to believe you imagined it. What I'm about to tell you, I could not have imagined. Because I almost walked past that foal. I almost let the auctioneer's voice carry me right on past him, same as everyone else had. And I have thought about that moment, that almost, more times than I can count. What kind of man I would have remained if I had. What I would never have learned about stubbornness and grief and the specific, quiet courage it takes to keep standing when the world has decided you don't matter. His name was eventually Cowboy. The auction house outside Deming, New Mexico smelled the way all auction houses smell. Manure, sawdust, diesel, and the particular musk of animals pressed too close together under corrugated iron in August heat. I had driven 4 hours to get there, not for the donkey, not for anything specific. My neighbor Hector Vasquez had called me the night before and said there was a good draft mule being run through the pens, one that might suit the rocky terrain on my back 40 where the tractor couldn't reach. That's what I came for, the mule. I almost didn't even walk the holding pens. But I have this habit, the logbook is part of it, but the walking is older, of doing a full circuit of any livestock situation before I make a decision about any one animal. My father called it reading the room. He meant that animals tell you more about a place by how they behave collectively than any individual inspection ever will. Agitated stock in a calm pen means something. Calm stock in a chaotic pen means something else entirely. You walk the whole picture before you focus on any single piece of it. So I walked. The draft mule was in pen 7 near the back. Fine animal, good hocks, sound feet, steady eye. I made my notes in the logbook. Pen length, condition of hooves, whether the ears tracked noise calmly or nervously. Hector was right. The mule would work. I circled the notation with my pencil the way I mark things I intend to bid on. Then I kept walking, because I wasn't done with my circuit. Pen 12 was the overflow pen. I knew it before I reached it because the noise dropped. The goats in pen 11 were vocal, pushing against their gate, and then you turned the corner into pen 12, and the sound fell away into this low, uncomfortable quiet. 30-some animals packed into a space built for 20. Nobody was fighting. Nobody was particularly distressed in any visible way. They just sorted themselves into the resignation that animals reach when they've been in transit too long, and the food has been too irregular, and they've learned that raising a fuss produces nothing. I scanned the pen the way I always do, left to right, back to front. And that's when I saw him. Far back corner, right up against where 2 fence panels met at a crooked angle, creating this narrow triangular space that was somehow less crowded than the rest of the pen. He'd found it the way small things find margins, not by strategy, but by being small enough and unimportant enough that no one bothered him for the space. A jenny was sleeping standing up 6 feet to his left and hadn't acknowledged him. 2 goats had posted themselves between him and the main herd, not deliberately excluding him, but the effect was the same. He was a foal, 4 months, maybe pushing 5, dark gray coat that hadn't yet decided if it was going to shade toward brown or stay the color of old pewter, big head on a narrow neck, ears that should have been his most expressive feature, the way donkey ears always are, but they were lying flat and sideways in a way that wasn't aggression. It was the ear position of an animal that has stopped expecting to communicate. Feet turned slightly inward, ribs visible, not starved, but not well fed either. His eyes were open, he wasn't sleeping. He was just standing there, in the middle of August, in a packed pen, surrounded by living things, staring at nothing. I stopped walking. Here is what I wrote in my logbook, standing at the rail of pen 12, and I am copying it verbatim because I want you to understand that I registered what I saw before I let myself feel anything about it. Gray donkey foal, back corner pen 12. No obvious injury, not eating, not interacting. Bilateral ear depression without aggression. Possible depression or learned helplessness. Has not moved since I arrived at rail, approx. 4 minutes. No animal in pen has approached or acknowledged. Then I drew a small asterisk next to the entry. My father's system, the asterisk meant come back to this. I finished my circuit. I went and found Hector near the coffee cart outside the main barn, and he handed me a cup without asking how I took it because we'd known each other long enough that he already knew. We talked about the mule. We talked about the summer feed prices, which were ugly, and about whether Hector's youngest boy was going to take over the operation when Hector eventually stepped back, which was a conversation we'd been having in small installments for 2 years. Hector noticed I was distracted. "You look like a man who found something he wasn't looking for," he said. "Maybe. The mule." "No, the mule's fine. The mule's straightforward." He waited. Hector has the gift of waiting. Most men rush to fill silence. Hector lets it sit there until it gets uncomfortable enough that you say the thing you actually meant to say. "There's a foal in pen 12, I said. "Gray donkey, young one." "And he's given up." Hector sipped his coffee. "Animals do that." "I know they do. Auction pen'll do that to a young one. Stress, separation, new smells. He'll come out of it in a home environment if someone takes him." "If someone takes him," I said. Hector looked at me over the rim of his cup. He had the kind of eyes that have seen enough hard country that they don't waste expression on anything that isn't worth it. He wasn't judging me. He was calculating something. "You already wrote it down, didn't you?" he said, not a question. I put an asterisk. He made a sound that was half laugh, half something that didn't have a name. "Your daddy's asterisks." He shook his head. "How many times did those asterisks cost him?" "More times than I can count." "And you?" I didn't answer that one. I went back to pen 12 before the auction started. I told myself I was doing due diligence. I told myself I was completing the professional assessment I'd begun, and that I would look at the foal objectively and determine whether he was medically compromised in some way that made him a poor acquisition risk, and that would settle it. That's what I told myself. I crawled through the gate bars. The pen wasn't set up for easy human entry, and walked slowly through the herd toward the back corner. Animals shifted around me without urgency. The Jenny opened one eye, decided I wasn't interesting, closed it again. The goats moved aside. The foal didn't move. He tracked me. His eyes followed my approach with the slow, reluctant attention of something that has learned that attention usually means nothing good is coming. His ears flicked once. Not the curious, swiveling radar of a healthy young donkey, but a single involuntary twitch, like a reflex he couldn't quite suppress. I crouched about 4 feet in front of him. He didn't step back. That was the thing that got me. A healthy foal, even a stressed one, even a timid one, steps back when an unknown human crouches at close range. It's instinct, the flight reflex. He just stood there and looked at me, and in his eyes was this expression that I have spent a year trying to find the right word for, and the best I've managed is unbothered by outcome. Not calm, not resigned exactly, just past the point of having a preference about what happened next. I extended my hand, palm up, fingers loose. He looked at it. He didn't sniff it. He didn't step toward it. He just looked at it the way you look at something that has never once been worth looking at, and you're not yet sure this time is different. I stayed crouched. He looked at my hand for a long time. Then he looked at my face. Then he looked back at my hand. And then, with the smallest, most exhausted movement I have ever seen from a living thing, he lowered his nose half an inch and made the lightest contact with my palm. Not a sniff, not a nuzzle, just a touch. And then immediately raised his head again and looked away, like he'd decided even that much was too much investment. I wrote in my logbook, still no name. Then I went and told the auction clerk I wanted to add the gray donkey foal from pen 12 to my bid list. The clerk looked at my paperwork, looked at the pen number, looked at me with the expression of a man who has seen ranchers make sentimental decisions many times and has learned that commenting on it is not his job. "That one's in the low lot," he said. "Probably won't get much action." I figured. "You know anything about donkeys, specifically?" "Horses mostly, some mule experience." He nodded in the way that means that's not really the same thing, but all right. "They're different from horses," he said. "Mentally, I mean, people underestimate how different." "I've heard that. They don't spook the same, they don't respond the same. You push a donkey too hard, he'll shut down on you completely. Push him too little, he won't respect you. It's a narrower window than most people think." I appreciated him telling me. He didn't have to. "What else?" I asked. He leaned on the counter. "Donkeys bond slow and they bond deep. You earn one, you really earn one. But if they decide they don't trust you, you might never get it back." He paused. "And they remember everything, good and bad, for years." I thought about the foal standing in the corner, and about the particular expression in his eyes, and about everything that everything might mean for an animal that age. "He's been overlooked his whole short life," I said, not really to the clerk. The clerk just shrugged. "A lot of them are." I got him for $43. There were two other bids, one from a man I didn't recognize who dropped out quickly, and one from a woman with a small goat operation near Las Cruces who told me afterward that she'd bid more on instinct than intention and was actually relieved when I got him. "I didn't need another animal," she admitted. "I just didn't like the idea of nobody wanting him." I told her I understood exactly. I also bought the draft mule, which was the entire original reason I'd driven 4 hours. Hector walked out with me to the trailer and helped me load the mule, which was cooperative and unbothered, and then we went back for the foal. Getting him into the trailer was the first real difficulty. Not because he panicked, not because he fought, the exact opposite. He stood at the base of the loading ramp and simply did not move, not refusing in any aggressive way, no backward pulling, no head tossing, no planted hooves in active resistance. He just stopped, stood, and waited with that same unbothered by outcome patience for whatever was going to happen next. I tried leading him forward. He allowed the lead rope without protest and moved right up to the edge of the ramp and stopped again. Hector tried standing inside the trailer and calling to him. The foal looked at Hector with mild interest and didn't move. I tried a grain bucket. He sniffed toward it but made no commitment. We stood there for 11 minutes. I know because I wrote down the time in my logbook. After 7 minutes, Hector suggested loading the mule first, which we did, and then putting the grain bucket just inside the trailer so the foal could see and smell it from the ramp. The foal considered this arrangement for another 4 minutes. And then he walked up the ramp. Not quickly, not enthusiastically, but deliberately, one step at a time, pausing on each one. He got into the trailer, ate some grain, and stood next to the mule without looking at either of us. Hector said, "Huh?" "Yeah," I said. He made up his own mind. "Eventually." "Took a while." "He's thinking it through," I said. He needed the grain to be real before he'd trust the idea of it. Hector considered this. "That's not unreasonable," he said. "No," I agreed, "it's not." The drive home took 4.5 hours because I took the slower route to keep the trailer stable. I stopped once in a rest area near Hatch and walked back to check on both animals. The mule was settled. The foal was standing with his head low, not eating, not sleeping, just existing in the low rumbled darkness of the moving trailer. I sat on the trailer floor next to him for a few minutes. I don't know why exactly. I told myself it was to monitor his stress response. But I think actually I just didn't want him to be in the dark alone. The mule ignored me. The foal eventually turned his head and looked at me in the dim light coming through the ventilation slots, and his expression was different here than it had been in the pen. Not better, not warmer, but different. Something slightly more present, like the geography of the situation had changed enough that he was revising his assessment. I wrote in my logbook, "He's watching, that's different from before, he's watching." It doesn't sound like much, but I knew enough by then to know it was something. I live on a property my grandfather homesteaded outside of Chilarosa, backed up against the Sacramento foothills, where the terrain goes from flat desert scrub to pinyon-studded slope in the space of about a mile. 60 acres, most of it rough. The back 40 I'd mentioned to Hector is where the irrigation ditch runs and the brush gets thick, and the tractor has broken its own axle twice trying to manage the ground. My father ran cattle on it. I run fewer cattle and more mixed stock now, 3 horses, some chickens, goats, the new mule. I'm not getting rich. I'm not trying to. I have a dog named Pero, which is not the most inventive name for a dog, but he wandered up one August day when he was a puppy, and I called him Pero until I thought of something better, and then somehow that became his permanent name. He's a heeler mix, old now, 9 or 10, with one ear that won't stand up all the way. He met the trailer in the driveway when I got home at nearly midnight, tail going, uncertain about the new smells. I put the mule in the main pasture paddock and set up a temporary smaller pen near the barn for the foal. Not because he needed quarantine, exactly, but because I didn't want to throw him into the social dynamics of the existing herd before he had any footing. He came out of the trailer the way he'd gone in on his own schedule, one deliberate step at a time. He walked into the small pen and stood in the middle and looked at the dark landscape around him. The barn wall, the fencing, the distant hills silhouetted against a sky full of stars, Pero watching him from a safe distance with intense professional curiosity. I brought him water, he drank eventually. I brought hay, he sniffed it and then looked away. I wrote in my logbook by flashlight, "He's here. Doesn't know what here means yet, neither do I fully." Then I closed the logbook and went inside. The next 3 days were a study in patience, and I want to be honest about how difficult that was. I am not naturally a patient man. I have a tendency, my father had it too, it skipped my mother entirely, which is probably why she was the better of the two of them with animals, to press forward before the situation is ready, to decide that enough time has passed and progress should be visible, to interpret stillness as stagnation and want to fix it. The foal was teaching me something about that interpretation from the very first morning. I went out at first light and sat outside his pen with my coffee and my logbook. I didn't go in, didn't approach the fence, just sat on an upturned bucket about 15 feet from the rails and wrote my morning notes and drank my coffee. He watched me the whole time. Ears mobile now, not the flat suppressed position of the auction pen, but not the full alert position of a relaxed animal either. Somewhere in between, tracking me. I did the same thing the second morning. On the third morning, he walked to the fence nearest to where I was sitting. He didn't do anything when he got there. He stood at the rail and looked at me, and I looked at him, and Pero looked at both of us from a diplomatic distance. The foal's ears were in the mobile, considering position. He had not yet decided anything. I wrote in my logbook, he came to me this morning, didn't close the distance, just reduced it on his own initiative, his choice. The asterisk I put next to that entry was the largest one I'd written in years. By the end of the first week, he was eating normally. By the end of the second, he was drinking without hesitation and moving around his pen with some energy. His ribs disappeared under a coat that was starting to fill out. He was still quiet, still watchful, still inclined to stand in corners rather than centers, the margins habit dying hard, but the expression in his eyes had changed. The unbothered by outcome quality was still there, but something was layering in underneath it. Interest, wary, conditional, testing the hypothesis carefully, interest, but interest. On the 14th day, I named him. I had been waiting, deliberately, because naming means you've decided it's worth the grief. And I'd been watching him choose whether he wanted to be in relationship with this place, with me, with the possibility of mattering. I didn't think it was right to name him before he'd had some say in it. But on the 14th morning, he put his nose through the fence rail and touched my hand. Not the exhausted half-contact of the auction pen, a real investigation. He sniffed my palm, my wrist, the cuff of my work shirt. His whiskers ticked against my skin. He blew a soft breath through his nose and then looked up at me with ears fully forward for the first time. I said cobber. It means copper in Spanish. He wasn't copper-colored, not exactly, but there's a copper mine up in the foothills that my grandfather used to talk about, and cobber was the name of the canyon it sat in, and something about the word felt right for something that had been buried in the earth and was only now being brought up into light. He flicked his ears at the sound of it. Cobber, I said again, and he didn't look away. That should have been enough of a story. A sad animal found, brought home, given a name, brought back into the world. Most people would write that up and consider it concluded. Good deed done, lessons approximately learned, life continuing. But Cowboy wasn't done teaching me things. He was, in fact, barely getting started. And what happened in the weeks after? What happened with the Apache family whose property bordered mine to the east? What happened with my own particular stubbornness, and the moment it nearly cost both of us everything? That story is longer and harder than the auction pen, and it begins, as most real stories do, with a misunderstanding that neither party recognized as a misunderstanding until the damage was already underway. I'll start it the right way, the way my father taught me, with the weather. The morning it began, I wrote in my logbook, sky yellow-green at first light. Wind moving wrong, northeast instead of west. Something's building. I was right about the building. I was wrong about what it was building toward. And Cowboy, standing in his pen with his ears up, and his eyes watching the eastern fence line with an attention I hadn't seen from him before, knew something was coming before I did. That's the thing about animals that have learned to read situations carefully, that have had to read situations carefully, for survival, for long enough that it becomes not skill but instinct. They see the horizon before you do. And Cowboy, overlooked and unnamed for the first months of his life, had developed the particular seeing of the long ignored, wide, low, and very, very precise. He was looking east, and 2 miles east, on the property that butted against mine along the old fence line my grandfather built in 1931, something was already happening. The fence line on the eastern edge of my property runs for about half a mile before it hits a dry arroyo, then drops down the embankment and continues on the other side in worse condition. Some of the old cedar posts rotted at the base, wire gone slack in places. One section where a flash flood 3 years ago took out about 40 feet entirely, and both I and the family on the other side had agreed, without putting it in writing, that we'd each maintain our own side when we got around to it. The family on the other side was Mescalero Apache, the Tafoya Rios family, though that's the Spanish-registered name they've used on the county deed for generations. The original family name is something my grandfather said he never heard spoken outside of ceremony. Old Mescalero land, some of it. The Bureau of Land Management lines and the private property lines in that part of New Mexico are tangled in a way that was never fully untangled and probably never will be. And the practical arrangement between my family and the Tafoya Rios family over the decades had been a neighborly one, a shared understanding of where the real boundaries were, even when the surveyed ones disagreed. My father knew old Esteban Tafoya Rios well. They'd fixed fence together, argued about water rights together, traded labor during branding season without keeping count of who owed what. When my father died, Esteban came to the service and stood in the back and said nothing and left before the reception, which is how I knew he'd actually meant to come and wasn't there for performance. Esteban had been gone 3 years now. His daughter, Marisol, and her son, a young man named Tomás who was about 22, worked the property. I'd met Marisol twice at the county water board meeting. We'd been civil. I didn't know Tomás at all. The morning after I noticed Cowboy watching the eastern fence line, I saddled one of my horses and rode out to check it. The fence was down. Not just the old flood section, a new section 40 feet further north had come down. Recent, by the look of the ground, the wire ends were bright, not weathered. Posts had been pulled, not broken, which meant human hands. On my side of the line, the ground was disturbed in a way that suggested heavy equipment had worked it recently. On their side, I could see about 200 yards further east the beginning of what looked like a stock watering project, a new tank being constructed, earthworks fresh and raw. An excavator was parked near it, engine off. No one around. I sat on my horse for a while and looked at the fence. Then I looked at the tank construction. Then I looked at where the fence used to be and did the rough mental geometry of the situation. The pulled section was right where the new tank access road appeared to start. The most logical route from the Tafoya Rios property to the construction site ran directly through the ground where my fence had been. It was possible this was an honest mistake, a contractor who didn't check the property lines, working quickly, pulling wire that was in the way without thinking about whose wire it was. It was possible. I wrote in my logbook, fence down east line, recent, coincides with new tank construction on Tafoya Rios land, assuming error will approach directly. The word assuming is there for a reason. I put it there deliberately because I've learned, not fast enough, but eventually, that when I stop assuming and start concluding, I make the kind of mistakes that are hard to take back. I rode back to the barn, unsaddled, and drove my truck around to the county road, and then the long way to the Tafoya Rio's property gate. Nobody answered when I knocked. The house was a low adobe structure set back from the road, with a covered porch running its full length and several large cottonwoods in the yard that had to be at least 80 years old. Chickens in a pen off the side of the house. Horses in a distant pasture, good-looking stock, well-kept. A work truck parked near the barn with the doors open. I knocked again, waited, walked to the edge of the porch and called out. The young man, Tamaz, came around the corner of the barn with a wrench in his hand and an expression that was not quite unfriendly, but was definitely not warm. He was about my height, darker-skinned, with his mother's sharp cheekbones and eyes that went carefully over me from boot to hat before they settled. "Help you," he said. "I'm your neighbor from the west," I said. "Harlan, my family's property runs along your eastern fence." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "I know who you are." "All right, I came to talk about the fence." He didn't react. "Someone pulled about 40 feet of wire on the east line," I said. "Looks recent. Looks like it might be related to the tank project you've got going out there. I'm not coming to make trouble, I just need to understand what happened so we can figure out how to put it right." He turned the wrench in his hand once. "My mother isn't here." "I'm not asking for your mother, I'm asking you." Another small shift, not irritation or not only irritation, something more complicated underneath it. "The contractor pulled it," he said finally. He said the line he was working from showed the fence further north. "The fence hasn't been further north since 1931, I said. "I know that now." Silence. "Is the contractor putting it back?" I asked. He said it wasn't his responsibility, because he was working from survey data his company provided. I'd dealt with contractors who worked from bad survey data before. It doesn't get less frustrating with experience. "Okay," I said, "that's his position, what's yours?" He looked at me for a long moment. He was doing the same thing I'd been trying to do, assuming rather than concluding, reading rather than reacting. I recognized it because I'd just been practicing it myself. "Our position," he said carefully, "is that the fence came down because of our project and we should put it back." He paused. "My mother will want to be part of that conversation. She's in town until this afternoon." "Tell her to call me," I said, "or don't, I can come back." "She'll call." I nodded and was about to go when something stopped me. A sound or the absence of one. I turned back toward the far pasture and that's when I saw it, a figure on the ground near the fence, which I'd taken for a shadow or a pile of equipment moving. An animal, struggling. "What's that?" I said. Tamaz looked where I was looking, his jaw tightened. "A colt," he said. "He got caught in some old wire back there this morning. We're watching him. Watching him to see if he can get up." I looked at him. "Can I see him?" He hesitated. That hesitation was complicated. It wasn't distrust exactly, but it was something in the territory near it. I waited it out. Hector's method. "Come on," Tamaz said finally. The colt was a young horse, maybe 8 months. Bay with a white blaze, one white stocking on the left fore. He'd gotten himself tangled in some old wire half buried along the base of the back fence, the kind of wire that's been there long enough to look like just another irregularity in the ground until an animal's hoof finds it. His right rear leg was wrapped twice, not deeply cut, but cut enough. He was down on his side and had spent enough energy fighting it that he'd stopped. Lying there breathing hard, eyes showing white at the edges. I crouched about 10 feet out and looked at him. Tamaz stood beside me. I could feel him watching both the colt and me. "How long?" I asked. "About 2 hours. He's settled a little." "Has he tried to get up?" 3 times, wore himself out. I looked at the wire, looked at the angle of the leg, looked at the colt's breathing and the position of his body on the ground and the way his free legs were arranged. "He can get up if the wire is off him," I said. "He's not cast badly, he's just done fighting something he doesn't understand." "I know," Tamaz said, flat, not agreeing with me, not disagreeing, just registering that I'd said it. "You have wire cutters?" I asked. I was waiting for the vet. "That's the right call normally. How far out is the vet?" 45 minutes minimum. She's in Alamogordo." I looked at the leg again. The wire had 2 wraps, one near the fetlock, one higher. The cuts were superficial. The colt wasn't losing significant blood. But he was, by my reading, close to the kind of exhaustion that starts causing secondary problems. He'd already been fighting the wire for 2 hours. Another 45 minutes on his side in August heat, stressed, burning through reserves, working against that wire with even occasional spasms. "Do you want my help?" I said. I asked it carefully. Not "I can help," not "you need help," just "do you want it?" Because the situation was complicated enough, with the fence and the contractor and 2 families and old boundary lines, that I wasn't going to push myself into something that wasn't mine without being invited. Tamaz looked at me for what felt like a long time. "Yeah," he said. Getting the wire off the colt took 22 minutes. I know because Tamaz timed it and told me afterward. I wasn't keeping count. I was focused on the work, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, talking low and constant the way my father taught me to talk to downed horses, not words exactly, just the sound of a human voice that is not alarmed. The wire cutters I'd had in my truck were good ones, with long handles for leverage, which mattered because the second wrap was under the colt's leg, and I had to work at a difficult angle without shifting his weight in a way that would panic him. Tamaz held the colt's head. He was good at it, calm, no wasted movement, one hand on the colt's jaw, one on his neck, talking to him in something that was a mix of Spanish and, I thought, something else. Not a language I recognized, low and rhythmic. The first wrap came free in about 4 minutes. The colt felt it and tried to get up immediately. Tamaz held him with both hands and that low voice, and the colt fought for a few seconds and then went back down, sides heaving. The second wrap took longer. It had tightened in a way that made cutting it risky, the angle of the blades relative to the leg. I had to reposition twice. In between repositions, I sat back and breathed and assessed rather than pushing through, which was hard, because sitting back when something is wrong goes against everything in me. "You're patient," Tamaz observed. "I'm working at it," I said honestly. He almost smiled, almost. When the second wrap came free, the colt lay still for a moment, just breathing. Tamaz kept his hands on him and kept talking. Then the colt's legs organized themselves, the big muscular sequence of a horse getting up, legs gathering under, neck lifting, hindquarters rising, and he was up, trembling some but standing. He shook himself. Put weight on the right rear, pulled it up slightly, put it back down. We watched. He put full weight on it. He took 2 careful steps. "He's okay," Tamaz said. "He's okay," I agreed. We stood there in the pasture while the colt walked slowly away from us, testing the leg with each step, moving toward the other horses at the far end. After a while, Tamaz said, "Thank you." I said, "Your fence line is holding old wire. You'll want to clear it." "I know. And my fence on the east line needs to go back up." "I know that too." I nodded. He nodded. 2 men standing in a pasture in August, both of them having chosen the harder, slower, more careful path through something that could have gone several other ways. "My mother will call you," he said. "Tell her Harland. She'll remember." "She remembers," he said. "She said you look like your father." I didn't have a response to that. I walked back to my truck and drove home the long way, and the whole drive I was thinking about what the auction clerk had told me about donkeys. They remember everything, good and bad, for years. Cowboy was at the fence when I got back, watching the driveway. I don't know how he knew I was coming before I turned in. Maybe the sound of the truck from further out than I'd expect a 4-month-old foal to register. Maybe some other sense. But he was at the rail, ears up, watching. I parked and sat in the truck for a moment with the windows down. The late afternoon light was coming in gold across the pasture, and Cowboy's gray coat caught it in a way that turned him very slightly amber at the edges. He was bigger than he'd been 3 weeks ago. His ribs were invisible now. His ears were up. He brayed when I got out of the truck. Not loudly, not the full rolling foghorn bray that donkeys can produce. A small sound, almost tentative, testing whether I would respond. I said, "I'm here." He tossed his head once and went back to watching the fence line, but his ears stayed up. I wrote in my logbook that night, "Something is being built between us. Can't call it trust yet. That's too large a word for where we are. But it's the beginning of something that might grow into trust if neither of us quits." He brayed at me today when I got home. Small sound, like he was checking. I checked back. Marisol Tafoya Rios called me the following morning, early. She had the voice of a woman who has managed a working property for a long time without expecting anything from anyone, not unfriendly, but efficient, and with a precision in her language that made every word land exactly where she put it. She said the contractor had agreed to repair the fence as part of the project settlement, and that she had looked at the survey and agreed with my reading of the line. She apologized for the oversight. She said the apology was genuine and not performative. I said I knew the difference, and I appreciated it. She said Tamaz had told her about the colt. I said it was nothing complicated, just wire cutting. She said he doesn't ask people for help easily. You should know that wasn't nothing for him. I said I understood more than she might think. She asked, in the way of someone who is genuinely curious rather than making conversation, what I'd been doing out on the property that particular morning. I told her I'd ridden the fence line because my foal had been watching east. There was a pause. A donkey foal, she said. Yes, gray one, about 4 months. And he was watching the east fence. Since the night before, I don't know what he sensed, something. Another pause, longer this time. My grandfather used to say, she said, and the word grandfather in her voice had a different weight than it does in most people's voices. Not nostalgia. Something more immediate, like the man was still somehow accessible in memory the way some are, that donkeys are the oldest of all domestic animals, and they haven't forgotten what they learned before they were domestic. I was quiet. He said if a donkey is watching something, there is something to watch, she said. He wasn't a mystical man, he was very practical, but he said that specifically about donkeys. How old was he when he told you that? 91, she said. He died at 94. Practical man, I said. Very, she said. And then the conversation moved on to fence repair logistics, and we agreed on a time for the contractor to come and do the work, and she said she would come herself to make sure it was done correctly. I hung up and looked at Cowboy through the kitchen window. He was standing in the middle of his pen now, not the corner center, in the full morning sun, and he was looking east. His ears were turning slowly, each independently, reading the air. I wrote, he is paying attention to something the rest of us haven't learned to see yet. But this is the part of the story where things get more complicated. Because in the same week that Cowboy was settling into his pen, and the fence negotiation was resolving itself with more grace than I'd expected, something else was building. Something I was actively avoiding seeing, because I didn't want to deal with it. Cowboy had not yet been introduced to the main pasture. I had a reason for this that I told myself was practical. He needed more time to establish himself, to gain strength, to develop a clearer sense of this place as his before I complicated it with the social dynamics of 3 horses, a mule, and a small herd of goats. That was my stated reason. I'd even written it in the logbook, which made it feel official. The real reason, and I didn't write this in the logbook because I didn't want to see it written, was that I was afraid he wasn't ready. And I was afraid that if I put him in the main pasture too soon and the horses ran him off, he would retreat back to wherever he'd been in that auction pen. That the margin-seeking, corner-standing stillness would return, that he'd give up again. And I wasn't ready to see that. That's the honest version. I was protecting him in a way that was also protecting myself. Marisol said something to me. On the second day she came to oversee the fence repair, that cut through it without her intending to. We were standing at the gate to Cowboy's pen while the contractor and Tamaz worked on the east line, and she was watching Cowboy with the specific attention of a woman who has lived around animals her whole life and reads them the way I read weather. How long have you had him in this pen alone? She said. About a month, I said. She didn't say anything for a moment, just watched him. He's ready, she said. I'm not sure. He's ready, she said again, firm, not unkind. He's standing in the center, he's not looking for corners, you're the one who's not ready. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the same expression Tamaz had used, no judgment, but no softening either. You're afraid to find out what he'll do when things are harder, she said. But keeping something safe past the point it needs safety isn't kindness, it's something else. I looked at Cowboy. He was standing in the center of his pen, full sun, ears up, and he was looking at the gate to the main pasture the way he'd looked at the ramp of my trailer on auction day, not panic, not eagerness. That careful, deliberate, I will go when I have decided assessment. He'd already decided. I was the one who hadn't caught up. I opened the gate between Cobber's pen and the main pasture the following morning. I did it early before the heat, and I stood well back, and I let it be his choice entirely. He walked to the gate, stopped, looked through it at the expanse of pasture and the horses moving in the far distance. He stood there for a long time, long enough that I started to think maybe Marisol had read it wrong, or I'd opened it at the wrong time, or he needed another week. Then he walked through, slowly, head up, ears fully forward, reading everything. The horses noticed immediately, heads up across the pasture, attention snapping to the new shape moving through their territory. The big bay mare, Sina, started toward him at a purposeful walk. My hands went tight at my sides. Sina came up fast and stopped about 15 feet from Cobber and blew hard through her nose, the warning assessment sound horses make at strange things. Cobber stopped walking. He stood completely still. He let her read him. Then he flicked his left ear toward her. Just the one ear. A deliberate gesture. Not submission, not challenge. Something in between, an acknowledgement that she was there and he was aware of her, and neither of those facts alarmed him. Sina blew again, took a step forward, stopped. Cobber turned his head slightly to look at her. Then he looked away. Not dismissively, not in the human way that would mean something aggressive, but in the animal way that means I am not a threat and you and I both know it, and there is nothing left to establish here. Sina stood for a moment. Then she turned and walked away. The other horses lost interest within minutes. The mule glanced at Cobber and resumed eating. The goats ignored him completely. Cobber walked to the water trough, drank, walked to a patch of shade at the east edge of the pasture near the fence line and stood there. He didn't look back at me. I wrote in my logbook, he knows what he's doing. He's always known what he's doing. I was the one who needed the month. That was the end of Part 2's lesson. But Part 3, which I did not see coming, which arrived the way hard things always do, as a consequence of decisions already made weeks earlier. That came on a Friday, in a rainstorm, and it changed what I thought I understood about courage, and about what it means to be the one who does the saving versus the one who teaches you that saving was never the right word for what was happening. I'll start where it started, with the storm and with Cobber standing at the east fence in the dark, braying at something I couldn't yet see. The storm came from the southwest, which is unusual for August in the Chilarosa Basin. We get our monsoon moisture from the Gulf. It rides up from the southeast and hits the Sacramento wall and dumps on the high slopes, and what gets through to the lower desert is what's left after the mountains take their cut. A southwest storm in August is something else. It means a system that didn't follow the pattern, and systems that don't follow patterns in desert country are the kind you pay attention to. I noticed the sky wrong at 4 in the afternoon. By 6 it was greenish. By 7, when I went out to feed, the wind had come around hard from the southwest, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. The horses were restless in the pasture, moving too fast for the time of day, circling without purpose. The mule had posted himself near the barn gate. The goats were already in the shelter of their enclosure, filed in without being asked, which goats only do when they sense something significant. Cobber was at the east fence. He was braying. Not continuously, short, insistent bursts. 3, 4 at a time, and then he'd stop and turn his head and listen, and then he'd bray again. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking east, past the fence line, into the scrub and the early dark. I stood in the barn doorway and watched him. My first instinct, and I am not proud of this, was to go get him. To open the pasture gate and herd him toward the barn before the storm hit. To take control of the situation and move my animals inside and lock everything down against the weather. That's the reflex of a man who manages things. When something is happening, make it stop happening, or at least stop the most uncertain part of it. But I'd been learning something from Cobber for a month now, about the difference between movement that helps and movement that interrupts. So instead of going to get him, I walked to the fence and stood near him. His ear registered me, that single-ear swivel that I'd come to recognize as his way of cataloging my presence without redirecting his attention. He knew I was there. He kept braying at the dark. I looked east. The scrub out there was thick, creosote and Apache plume and some old stands of cholla, and beyond that the dry arroyo where the flash floods run. Past the arroyo, the Tafoya Rio's land began. In daylight, you could see their barn from this fence line. In the dark, with the storm moving in, I could see nothing. But I could hear, under the sound of the wind and cobbers braying, something. I had to make myself be still to hear it. That's the thing about sound, it fills the space available to it, and human voices and animal voices and wind all compete, and the thing you're trying to hear is underneath all of that, something thin and irregular. But I heard it eventually. A voice, human, not calling out, more like talking or crying or both, the kind of sound a person makes when they're past the point of expecting to be heard and are just making the sound because stopping it would require energy they don't have. I said quietly to Cobber, "How long have you been hearing that?" He brayed again, facing east. I went back to the barn and got my flashlight and my work jacket and told Pero to stay, which he ignored. I climbed the east fence, the new section, properly strung, and walked into the scrub toward the arroyo. 30 yards past the fence, the scrub thickened and the ground started dropping. The arroyo wasn't visible yet, but you could feel it in the topography, the slight lean of the land, the way the plants changed from upland scrub to the moisture-seeking growth that clusters around seasonal water. The flashlight found Tamaz before my ears confirmed where the sound was coming from. He was at the base of the arroyo bank, maybe 6 feet down from the rim, sitting with his back against the root-knuckled base of an old cottonwood. His left leg was at an angle that made my stomach drop. Not catastrophically wrong, not a compound break, nothing visible through his jeans, but wrong enough that one look told you he wasn't walking out of there on his own. He had his phone in his hand, screen dark. "Battery died," he said when the flashlight found him. His voice was even, not calm exactly, but with the practiced evenness of someone who has been managing their own fear for a while and gotten it under a kind of temporary control. "How long have you been down there?" I said. "Couple hours, maybe more, lost track." "What happened?" "Came to check the fence before the storm, slipped on the bank. My foot went into that old hole at the base of this tree." I looked at his leg, looked at the cottonwood's root system. There was a void there, a depression in the earth where the roots had created a hollow, and if your foot went in at the wrong angle while you were in motion. "Can you feel your foot?" I said. "Yes," he said, "it hurts." "Good, that's good." I looked up at the rim, 6 feet of unstable bank in the dark with weather building. "I'm going to get a rope, don't try to move the leg." "I haven't," he said, dry, almost that almost smile. I went back over the fence at a speed I don't usually move at and found my long lasso rope in the barn. Pero was watching me with his professional intensity. I coiled the rope, grabbed my truck's jumper cables, I wasn't sure why yet, some instinct, and went back to the fence. Cobber was still at the east fence. He had stopped braying, he was watching me. "I heard him," I said to the donkey, out loud to the donkey in the dark with a storm coming. "I'm aware of how that sounds. Good job." His ear moved. He watched me climb the fence and go back into the scrub. Getting Tamaz out of the arroyo was 40 minutes of hard, careful work. The problem wasn't the rope. We got that rigged quickly enough, with Tamaz able to use his good leg and his arms and the rope together to manage most of his own weight while I braced on the rim. The problem was the bank itself. The soil was already loosening as the moisture changed in the air ahead of the storm, and every foot of purchase I gained by digging in at the rim I lost in slow, sliding inches as the ground gave way. I lay flat at the top and dug my elbows into the dirt, and had the rope wrapped twice around my forearm and talked Tamaz up the last 2 feet, while my entire body moved incrementally toward the edge. The moment he got a hand on the rim grass and pulled himself over was the moment I understood what the jumper cables were for. I'd looped them around a heavy root cluster 6 feet back from the edge and the other end around my belt while I was bracing, and those cables were the reason I was still on the rim and not in the arroyo with him. We lay there for a moment, both breathing. "Is it broken?" I said. "Probably," he said. "Feels like something moved that shouldn't have." "Can you make it to my truck?" "I can make it to your truck." He couldn't quite. He made it about 60 yards on my shoulder before the leg refused further cooperation, and I ended up with him sitting on the fence rail while I pulled my truck through the pasture gate and drove to him. Cobber stepped aside to let the truck pass and watched from 12 feet away as I helped Tamaz into the passenger seat. "That your foal?" Tamaz said. "That's Cobber." He was the one making noise earlier. I could hear him from the arroyo. He could hear you, I said. He was braying since before I came out to feed. Tomás looked at Cowboy through the truck window for a moment. His face in the dome light was gray with pain and the kind of relief that comes after sustained fear, which has its own particular look, looser than normal, not quite in control of itself. How long had he been hearing me? He said. I don't know, I said. Long time. Tomás looked at the donkey for a moment longer. Long time, he repeated quietly, as if that meant something specific. The storm broke while I was driving to the hospital. Not where I was, but I could see it on the eastern horizon, lightning deep inside the cloud mass, the kind that illuminates the whole interior of a system without hitting ground. Tomás watched it through the window the whole drive. I didn't try to make conversation. I drove and occasionally checked the leg, which he'd elevated on the dash, and thought about Cowboy standing at that fence in the dark and braying at something I hadn't known to look for. The ankle was broken, fibula clean fracture. The ER doctor said he'd made it worse by being on it in the arroyo, but that the damage was manageable, and in 6 to 8 weeks it would be mostly healed. Marisol arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after we did, and when she came into the waiting room, she did the thing parents do, take the full measure of their child with one look, confirming that what they feared is not what they found, and then she was composed again. She thanked me in the direct way she'd thanked me before, with words that landed where she put them. I left when it was clear Tomás was stable and Marisol was settled. In the truck on the way home, alone, I turned the radio off and drove in the dark and thought about what the 4 months since the auction had been teaching me. Here is what I wrote that night. I'm going to copy the logbook entry directly, because it was the longest entry I'd made since my father died, and I think it says it better than I would reconstructing it. Tomás Tafoya Rio's ankle fracture brought to Alamogordo General. He's fine. Fence contractor finished the east line last week. Holds well. The goats were right about the storm. It ran through fast, about 2 inches at the rain gauge, no major damage. Cowboy heard Tomás in the arroyo before I knew Tomás was in the arroyo. He was braying at the east fence for what Tomás thinks was close to 2 hours before I came to feed. 2 hours. Alone in a pen while the herd ignored him, standing at a fence in the dark and making a sound that nobody came to investigate. He kept making it anyway. I have been thinking about what the clerk at the auction said. That donkeys remember everything, good and bad, for years. And I have been thinking about what it means that Cowboy had been taught, by however many months of being in the corner, of being the overlooked one, of touching my hand, and then pulling back because he'd learned that touching things doesn't change them, had been taught by all of that to believe that what he said into the dark didn't matter. And he said it anyway. That's not resilience in the way I usually use the word. Resilience is what you call it when someone bounces back. This is different. This is what you do when you don't know if there's anything to bounce back to, but you do the thing regardless. You stand at the fence, and you bray into the dark because you heard something that needed to be heard, and whether anyone comes is a separate question from whether you make the sound. I've been thinking I was saving him. $43 and a slow, patient month and learning to wait, and I'd been carrying that in my chest like it meant something about me, about what kind of man I was. But he's the one who found Tomás. He's the one who kept braying when I wasn't there to hear it. He'd been standing at that fence for 2 hours before I came. I bought him home, but I'm not sure saving is the right word for what he did with that. The weeks after the storm settled into something new. Cowboy had full pasture access now, and he used it differently than I expected. Not sociably, not the way a horse establishes itself in a herd through movement and display. He stayed on the perimeter, always walking the edges of the property, particularly the eastern edge, as though he'd appointed himself to that duty and considered it his. The horses ignored him now, not the way they'd initially ignored him, which was the ignoring of animals who haven't assessed something yet, but the ignoring of animals that have made a determination and settled it. He was here. He was part of this. Done. The mule, who had been the most skeptical in those early days, occasionally walked the eastern fence line with him. I noticed this first on a Tuesday and then again on a Thursday, and then realized it was a regular pattern. The mule, a 10-year-old with no apparent interest in companionship, who had worked alone and roomed alone and seemed to consider other animals a minor inconvenience, had adopted Cowboy's patrol as something worth joining. I mentioned this to Marisol when she came to check the fence repair in late September. Tamaz was on crutches by then, doing better, standing in the barn doorway while his mother walked the fence line with me. Animals that have been alone for a long time recognize each other, she said. Not the species, the experience. I thought about the mule's history. I'd bought him 3 years ago from a man who was moving and needed to place animals quickly. He'd been alone in a small pen for the better part of a year before that. I'd assumed he just had a solitary temperament. I hadn't thought about what had made him that way. "Did your grandfather have a donkey?" I asked Marisol. She smiled, actually smiled, which I hadn't quite seen before. "He had a Jenny named Coyote Woman," she said. "She lived to be 34 years old. He said she was the most honest animal he'd ever known." "Honest," I repeated. "Honest," she said. "He meant that she never pretended to feel something she didn't feel, and she never pretended not to feel something she did. Whatever she was entirely. He said that was rare." I looked at Cowboy, walking the fence line with his mule companion in the September light, his ears in that open, forward position that had become his default now. Entirely what he was. That was it exactly. Tamaz came back to the fence line 6 weeks after the ankle fracture, 1 crutch now instead of 2. He came in the early evening, when the light was long and orange, and he stood at the east fence and looked over at Cowboy in the pasture. Cowboy walked to the fence. He stood there in front of Tamaz and looked at him. Tamaz looked back. I was working near the barn and watching from a distance. I didn't go over. Some things don't need a witness, or at least they don't need one close up. Tamaz extended his hand over the fence rail, palm up. Cowboy looked at it. He lowered his nose and sniffed it. A full, real investigation, whiskers and all, not the exhausted half-contact of the auction pen. He worked up from the palm to the wrist to the inside of Tamaz's forearm. He blew a breath through his nose against Tamaz's skin. Then he raised his head and looked at the young man's face. And Tamaz, who didn't ask for help easily, who had managed his own fear for 2 hours in an arroyo in the dark, who had learned at the side of a practical 91-year-old man that some things don't pretend. Tamaz put his free hand on Cowboy's nose. Just rested it there. Cowboy didn't move. I went back to what I was doing and didn't write anything in the logbook until later that night, when I was trying to find the right words for what I'd seen, and finally I just wrote. They recognized each other. What happened over the winter I could describe in many ways. But the simplest way is this. Cowboy became, without my quite planning it, the animal that people came to when they needed to think. Tamaz started coming on Tuesday evenings. He'd stand at the fence or, once the ankle healed, come into the pasture and walk the east line with Cowboy in step beside him. They didn't interact in any complicated way, no tricks, no training, nothing that could be called purposeful by any agricultural standard. They just walked the fence together. Tamaz would talk sometimes in that mix of Spanish and the other language, and Cowboy's ears would track the sound. Marisol said, once, that Tamaz had been struggling with something before the ankle fracture. Nothing she specified, just something. And that since the arroyo he'd been different. Not lighter, not fixed, but more present, more like himself. I didn't ask what the something was. Some things deserve their privacy. Pero, who had maintained a cautious diplomatic distance from Cowboy for months, finally came to the fence one morning and pressed his nose to the rails and held it there until Cowboy walked over and sniffed him once and then walked away. Pero considered this for a long moment and then lay down in the grass near the fence. Not in the pasture, not at the barn. Exactly there. The mule, who I still hadn't formally named, I'd been calling him the mule for 3 years, which is a more extreme version of the not-naming habit, got a name that winter. I named him Sombra, Shadow, because he was never far from Cowboy's side on the fence line, and because he'd been in shadow for 3 years before I understood that was what he'd been in, and because once you start naming things you can't unsee, you might as well go through with it. I'll tell you the last thing that mattered, because this story has been building toward it without my quite knowing where it was headed, and now I do. In January, a man from the County Agricultural Extension Office came to do a routine property inspection. Standard survey, new cattle proximity protocols related to some water quality ordinance. Nothing dramatic. He was young, professional, with a clipboard and a firm handshake, and he walked the property with me in the way people who are doing official things walk. Brisk, purposeful, not particularly looking at what's there, looking at what he'd been sent to find. We went through the pasture. He made notes. He stopped at the east fence and squinted at the fence repair and asked about the age of the original posts. I answered his questions. And then Cowboy walked over. The extension officer had not, I think, noticed Cowboy until Cowboy was at arm's length. He startled slightly, the involuntary flinch of a person who didn't expect an animal to approach them. Cowboy stopped about 4 feet out and regarded him with those big, dark eyes and his ears in the considering position. The officer looked at Cowboy. He had the expression of a man trying to determine what category this animal fell into and finding the categories insufficient. "Is he yours?" he said. "He is." "What's his background?" "Auction house outside Deming. Nobody wanted him. I bought him for $43. The officer looked at Cowboy for a moment. Something in his face shifted, briefly, quickly, the kind of micro-expression you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Then it settled back into professional neutral. "He looks healthy now," he said. "He is." "Good." He wrote something on his clipboard that I suspect had nothing to do with water quality ordinances. We finished the inspection. He shook my hand again at the gate and drove away, and I stood in the driveway for a while after the truck disappeared. I don't know what Cowboy represented to him in that moment. I don't know what he was going through in his own life or what the sight of an overlooked animal, healthy and present, and standing in the January sun on land that claimed him, meant to him personally. I didn't know him well enough to ask, and the moment had passed too quickly. But he'd looked at Cowboy for a long time before he wrote what he wrote on that clipboard. And I recognized the look. I'd had it myself, standing at the rail of Pen 12 in Deming in August in a different life. I am writing this in February. Cowboy is 6 months past the auction, which puts him close to 11 months old. He's grown significantly, still small as donkeys go, but solid now, the gray coat darkened to the pewter I suspected it would be. His ears are extraordinary, which I should have known they would be, the full, mobile, expressive instruments they're supposed to be, reading everything constantly. He has a habit of standing next to me when I'm doing fence work, not in my way, but close, watching what my hands are doing with the same careful attention he watches everything. He has not forgotten the margins. He still sometimes retreats to the edge when something surprises him, stands with the fence at his back and reads the situation before he decides to re-engage. Old habit, old survival. I don't try to train it out of him. You don't train out the things that kept something alive. Tamaz comes on Tuesdays. His ankle is fully healed and he has his grandfather's walk now, something in the gait I hadn't noticed before, the deliberate placing of each foot, as if the ground deserved to be acknowledged. I don't know if he always had it. I didn't know him before the arroyo. Marisol came in January with a bottle of something her grandmother made, an herbal preparation that tasted like pinon smoke and something sweet I couldn't identify. And we drank it at my kitchen table and talked about the water board situation and about her grandfather and about the water tank project, which was completed and working. She said her grandfather would have had a lot to say about Cowboy. I asked what he would have said. She thought about it for a long time, in the way she thinks about things, not reaching for an easy answer but waiting for the real one to arrive. He would have said, she said finally, that the animal found the right person. I started to say that I found him, that I'd gone to the auction and bought him for $43 and brought him home in a trailer. She looked at me. I stopped saying it. I look at that old logbook entry sometimes, the one from auction day. Gray donkey foal, back corner pen 12, no obvious injury, not eating, not interacting. I read it and then I look out the kitchen window at Cowboy walking the east fence line in the gray February light. Sombra somewhere behind him, Perro in his spot by the fence rail, the Sacramento foothills blue and cold in the distance. He is checking something. He is always checking something out there along that fence with those extraordinary ears turned to the east. I have stopped wondering what it is. I have started assuming it matters. My father's last logbook entry, the morning he died, I found it when I went through his things because he wrote every morning without exception, was 7 words. Check the fences, everything where it should be. I have thought about that entry many times over the years, what it meant that those were the last words he wrote. Whether it was a statement about the fences specifically or about something larger, Whether everything was a literal accounting or a metaphorical one. Whether he knew it would be the last thing he wrote, or whether he was just finishing the morning's record the way he always did. I don't know the answer, but I know what I wrote this morning. I know what I write every morning now, after the coffee and before the feeding, in the book my father gave me when I was 17. Cowboy walked the east line at first light. Ears east, south, east again. Nothing alarming or nothing I can see. He knows things I don't. I've stopped arguing with that. Weather clear, wind west. Everything where it should be.